Today we are looking at the CXN100, a brand new streaming DAC from Cambridge Audio, and we're going to assess it with 4 side-by-side comparisons using music that we might read about over on Pitchfork, Resident Advisor or the Quietus.
This episode is brought to you by Munich High-End, the world's leading international audio show, running May 9 through 12 at the MOC.
Welcome back everybody. Yes, the CXN100 sells for £100 more than its predecessor, the extremely popular CXN V2. Now, in return for that extra cash, we get a slightly larger screen flanked by a simplified array of control buttons, or rather it's more simplified. And we also get a new DAC circuit built around an ESS chipset instead of the V2's Wolfson circuit. So chip spotters will want to know about that, even though I've bored myself to death saying this, that the power supply and the analog output stage matter just as much as the chip in the sound of a DAC, and we don't know anything about those when it comes to the CXN100 here. But what we do know is that the digital volume control has been integrated within the DAC chip for 100 steps of control instead of the V2's 30 steps. Also inside the new model sits Cambridge Audio's Gen 4 Stream Magic module, which has been pulled from their Evo series of streaming amplifiers and things like that. Things like that, what am I talking about? But the upshot of that is that we no longer need a USB dongle for Wi-Fi. There are 2 little aerials on the back of the 100, and as was the case when we looked at the CXN V2 in 2020, the accompanying, I can't even say that, the accompanying Stream Magic app is easy to use, and it's essential if you want to stream Cobas outside of Roon or AirPlay or Chromecast, which are also built into the CXN100. But if you're old school and you don't like to use smartphone apps and you prefer to get hands-on with the unit, you can use the click buttons either side of the screen in tandem with the volume rotary for menu navigation. And it's so simple that my mom could do it, or your mom could do it. Me, I use the Stream Magic app to execute input changes or volume changes that can't be executed elsewhere. For example, the Toslink input that takes care of my TV's audio. The infrared remote control is now an optional extra, which sells for £25 in the UK, I think €30 here in Europe, and then weirdly $15 in the USA, and the remote is a total dad remote. But there is no HDMI ARC here, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity on behalf of Cambridge. But then again, I don't design hi-fi products for a living, so maybe there's something that I'm not seeing here as to why it wasn't included in the CXN100. But the upshot of no HDMI ARC is that because I don't have a 5-meter coax cable for my little Shanling CD transport, my TV and it have to sort of take turns using the CXN100's single Toslink input. The large rotary on the front of the 100 changes the volume when using it as a streaming preamplifier, and we have to enable that in the settings menu. And that streaming preamplifier functionality is exactly how I used the CXN100, alternatively feeding power amps from First Watt and Mytek. And then those amps alternated between the KEF R3 Meta and Zoo's DWX that you see behind me. Now, I made the pre-power connections with balanced cables one week and single-ended cables the next. And yes, they were the same model of AudioQuest cable, but I heard no discernible difference between the 2 connection types. So I stayed with single-ended RCAs because that's all that the First Watt amp will accept. The first big question here then is, how does the 100 compare to the V2? Now, as I've said many times before, the audible differences between DACs are much smaller than between rooms or speakers. And there is obviously no way I could have carried the sound of the V2 in my head for the 4 years since it was last here. So I had Cambridge Audio send me another V2 to lay the tracks for our first side-by-side comparison today. And the results were that the 100 separates the finer details from television's friction a little more cleanly than the V2. It's more precise and not as warm as the V2. And that means we also get a little bit more pep in the top end of El Perro del Mar's God Knows. And we also get a very slightly taller soundstage, but I wouldn't swear on that. So essentially, the 100 does not blow the V2 out of the water. In fact, I can see some people preferring the soon-to-be discontinued model's warmer tonality when listening to Prince's 5 Women. And pivotal to this side-by-side comparison between the old Cambridge Audio streaming DAC and the new one was Roon. And Roon is the main sponsor of this video. Now, both the CXN V2 and the CXN100 have been through Roon's Roon Ready certification process, which means they are guaranteed to behave flawlessly with Roon. Now, helping me in working out what the differences were between the V2 and the 100 in this video is Roon's ability, or our ability, to group those two devices inside the app so that they both receive the same streaming data at the same time. It's kind of like multi-room sync, really. So basically, with the same streaming data going to each device at the same time, I could just go backwards and forwards with the analog interconnects without having to worry about which device was playing which track and where we were within that track. But of course, the $1,000 network streaming or streaming DAC landscape has come a long way since we looked at the V2 in 2020. And the 100 must now compete with products coming from Chinese manufacturers like Eversolo and FiiO. So if you're already ahead of me here, you'll know that the Eversolo DMP-A6 is €200 cheaper than the CXN100, but broadens the available feature set with a touchscreen, VU meters, a cast app, and native Apple Music playback, including high-res audio. And just as I did with the V2's side-by-side comparison, I put the A6 up against the 100 in digital preamp mode. Now, the Cambridge Audio unit sounds fuller, fleshier, and altogether less nervy and edgy than the Eversolo. Again, not big differences, but I have to call them out where I think they might exist, even if they're small. The 100, I think it reminds us that the A6, I've said this before, it's a bit too bright. And that's something we can really hear on Rammstein's Heirate mich. On the other hand, the A6 is better at pulling apart instrumental layers and is likely to bring some life to Bill Callahan's downbeat Summer Painter when played back on sleepier sounding hi-fi systems or warmer sounding hi-fi systems. The 100 is for people who need more body than they need cleaner transient incision. And that's especially evident when listening to the Pixies at the BBC, whose raucous garage rock vibe really benefits from the 100's warmer tonality. And I don't mean warm like yellow or orange or red, I mean warm like a very soft beige. And also, that Pixies CD's cover art tells us that the 100 has a more colour accurate display than the outgoing V2. I'm not sure how relevant this next side-by-side comparison is, but I did it anyway. So the Bluesound NODE X sells for similar money to the 100, but it adds a very nice sounding headphone output and HDMI ARC functionality. So if you insist on having HDMI ARC, know that the Node X is the only streaming DAC in this video that has it. However, I don't think the Bluesound belongs really to the group of streaming DACs that you can put in your hi-fi rack and have it sort of show cover art or VU meters. And the Bluesound streaming DAC's sonic personality splits the difference between the A6 and the 100. So it's not as ectomorphic or as lit up in the treble as the Eversolo, but neither is it as golden hued or as chunky sounding as the Cambridge. Now I know that the whatabouters are going to ask, what about the FiiO R7, which I liked so much last year and I still do. Yep, that's another side-by-side comparison that I did, but like the Eversolo, it gives us a touchscreen and native Apple Music playback with high res and a more powerful headphone output than the Bluesound. And I also would say that the FiiO's double height makes it harder to place it in a hi-fi rack than the 100. But judged solely on its streaming DAC performance, the FiiO isn't quite as micro-dynamically alert as the Cambridge, which sounds more lively and more present. And the 100 also offers a little more tonal colour than the FiiO, which sounds timbrally, a little bit greyer by comparison than the Cambridge audio device. And no, in case you're wondering, that shortfall isn't entirely closed when adding FiiO's linear power supply to the R7. And for some weird reason, I don't know why, the addition of that PSU to the FiiO in the Mytek Zoo combination introduces some circuit noise that we can hear through the speakers. So I hope it's obvious by now that the CXN100 from Cambridge Audio is not for people who want headphone connectivity or a touchscreen. It's for people who want a streaming DAC that's a full width box and essentially one that matches their other gear. And it's also for people who want a device whose treble incision won't decapitate them when listening to poorer recordings. But most of all, it's for people who want a broad range of streaming connectivity that's super easy to use. And if you thought this video was super easy to watch, despite my hoarse voice because I've got man flu at the moment, then please consider subscribing and liking down below, and maybe give us a toodle pip in the comments to let us know that you stuck it out to the very end. And this is going to be the first of 3 videos about streaming DACs that sit at different price points. So the next video in this series will look at what we get when we spend twice the CXN100's asking. Oh, and if you want pre-made playlists of all the music seen and heard in this video, you can just head on over to my Patreon. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Yeah, and sorry about my voice. Two, 2, and as was the case with the CXN V2, the accompanying, and as was the case with the CXN V2. Me, I use the Stream Magic app for input and volume changes that can't be executed elsewhere, e.g. no. But no, I heard, and yes, they were the same model of audio. So I stayed with single-ended RCAs because that's the results. Well, the 100 separates finer details from, and just as I did with the, but judged solely on its streaming DAC performance, the FiiO isn't quite as and the but most of all, it's for people who want a broad range of streaming connectivity that's just quite, no.